Your body has one emergency cooling system. It is sweat. In the summer of 2026, across huge parts of America, that system started to fail. A heat dome is not a normal hot day. It is a lid of high pressure the size of several states, parking directly over cities and trapping the heat below like a lid on a pot. This year, it happened 3 times. We will step inside a Washington, D.C. record heatwave that broke a 4th of July record set generations ago. We will watch a power grid serving 67 million people push past its limits. We will go inside the 6 hours it takes a human body to reach the edge of survival. And we will follow a number most Americans have never heard of, one that may decide who lives and who does not as this heat keeps climbing. If you're new here, we cover the extreme edges of science and nature every week, so consider subscribing before we start. This is not a normal summer. Prepare yourselves. We begin. Picture your body as a car engine. It runs hot all the time, even when you feel cool. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought you have creates heat inside you, the same way an engine creates heat by burning fuel. Your body needs to get rid of that heat constantly, or it will overheat, just like a car left running in a closed garage. For almost all of human history, this was easy. Your body has one main trick for staying cool: sweat. Water rises to your skin, air touches it, and the water evaporates. That evaporation pulls heat away from you, the same way a wet swimsuit feels cold in a breeze. It is simple, it is elegant. It has kept humans alive in deserts, jungles, and everywhere in between for 200,000 years. But this trick has a weakness. It only works if the air around you is willing to accept more moisture. On a dry day, the air is thirsty. It grabs your sweat fast and carries the heat away with it. On a humid day, the air is already full of water. It cannot take much more. Your sweat sits on your skin instead of evaporating. You keep sweating, but the cooling stops working. This is the exact moment your body starts to lose. In the summer of 2026, this moment happened to millions of Americans at once. Cities across the eastern half of the country turned into places where the air itself refused to cool anyone down. Doctors call what happens next heat stress. Your heart beats faster, pumping blood toward your skin to release heat, which means less blood and oxygen reach your brain and other organs. You feel dizzy, your thinking gets foggy, your muscles cramp. This is your body sending out a warning flare, the human version of a check engine light. Most people recognize these signs and get somewhere cool, but not everyone can. A construction worker on a rooftop, an elderly person in an apartment with a broken air conditioner, a toddler left too long in a parked car. For these people, the warning flare goes unanswered, and the engine keeps overheating. Here is the number that should scare you more than any headline. Since 2018, heat has killed more Americans than any other type of weather disaster. Not hurricanes, not tornadoes, not floods. Heat is the quiet killer, the one that does not make dramatic footage of collapsed buildings or flooded streets. It just slowly shuts the body down, 1 degree at a time. What makes 2026 different is not that heat exists. Heat has always existed. What makes 2026 different is how often the danger threshold got crossed, how many places broke records that had stood for over a century, and how a brand new kind of weather pattern kept locking cities inside ovens for days at a time, with almost no chance to cool down, even at night. To understand why this summer felt like a turning point, you need to understand a number that most Americans have never heard of. It is not the temperature you see on your phone. It is something scientists call wet bulb temperature, and it might be the single most important number for predicting who survives extreme heat and who does not. That number was quietly climbing all summer long in places you would never expect. And in a few American cities it came closer to a dangerous line than most people realized. Every other animal on Earth has a heat problem. Dogs pant. Elephants flap their giant ears to release warmth through the blood vessels inside them. Pigs roll in mud because they barely sweat at all. Humans, though, evolved something better. We're covered in more sweat glands than almost any other mammal on the planet, something like 2 to 4 million of them across our skin. This is one of the reasons early humans could chase prey across the African savanna for hours, in blazing heat, while the animals they hunted eventually collapsed from exhaustion. Sweat made humans into long-distance heat machines. But this superpower runs on a hidden condition, one most people never think about. Sweat only cools you down if it can evaporate. Evaporation is the actual engine of the cooling system, not the sweat itself. When water changes from liquid to vapor, it pulls energy, in the form of heat, from whatever surface it touches. That surface is your skin. Take away the evaporation, and you're left with a wet, salty layer sitting uselessly on your body while your internal temperature keeps climbing. This is exactly what humidity does. Think of the air like a sponge. A dry sponge soaks up water fast. A sponge that is already soaked cannot take on much more. On a humid day, the air is already saturated with moisture, so it resists accepting the sweat evaporating off your skin. You feel sticky, not cool. Your body senses it is still overheating, so it does the only thing it knows how to do. It sweats even more. This creates a vicious cycle. More sweat, less cooling, more internal heat, and eventually a body that cannot regulate itself at all. This is why a 95-degree day in humid New Jersey can feel more dangerous than a 115-degree day in dry Arizona. The dry heat is intense, but your sweat still works. The humid heat traps you inside your own body. During the summer of 2026, this exact scenario played out across the eastern United States. Cities like Philadelphia and Newark did not just get hot, they got hot and wet at the same time, a combination scientists consider far more dangerous than dry heat alone. Overnight temperatures in some areas never dropped out of the high 70s, meaning the air stayed saturated with moisture around the clock. There was no relief, not even in the dark. Doctors have a phrase for what happens to a body stuck in these conditions for too long: uncompensable heat stress. It means your cooling system, sweat and all, cannot keep up with the heat your body's absorbing and generating no matter what you do. Once you reach this point, your internal temperature starts a slow, dangerous climb, and every minute that follows increases the risk of permanent organ damage. Scientists have spent the last several years trying to pin down the exact combination of heat and humidity where this failure becomes deadly. They needed a way to measure not just the temperature, but the temperature combined with how much moisture the air can still absorb. The tool they built for this is one you have probably never heard mentioned on the evening news, even though it might be the single most important number for understanding whether a heatwave is merely uncomfortable or genuinely lethal. It has a strange, technical-sounding name, but understanding it is the key to understanding everything that happened across America this summer. Imagine wrapping a wet cloth around a thermometer and swinging it through the air, like a cowboy twirling a rope. As the air moves across the wet cloth, water evaporates off it, and the thermometer reading drops. This old-fashioned experiment done by scientists for over a century measures something called wet bulb temperature. Today it gets calculated with math instead of a swinging thermometer, but the idea is the same. It captures both heat and humidity in a single number, and that number tells you something regular temperature never can. How well a human body can cool itself in that exact environment. Here is why this matters so much. A regular thermometer reading of 100 degrees does not tell you if that heat is survivable, but a wet bulb reading does, because it accounts for whether your sweat can actually evaporate. Scientists have long believed there is a wet bulb temperature above which the human body cannot cool itself at all, no matter what you do. For decades, that number was set at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the same temperature as your own skin. At that point, sweat stops working completely, heat starts building inside your body with nowhere to go, and even a young, healthy person in the shade with unlimited water would eventually die from it, usually within about 6 hours. Newer research has delivered a much scarier update. Scientists at Pennsylvania State University put young, healthy volunteers inside heat chambers and carefully raised the temperature and humidity while monitoring their core body temperature in real time. What they found broke the old assumption completely. Healthy people started losing the ability to regulate their body heat at wet bulb temperatures as low as 88 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 7 degrees below the number scientists had relied on for years. The danger zone was much closer than anyone thought. Think about how important this is. It means places that never reach the old, extreme 95-degree wet bulb threshold can still be lethal. It means the humid parts of the eastern United States, not just the deserts of the Southwest, can create genuinely unsurvivable conditions, especially for the elderly, for children, and for anyone with a heart condition, whose bodies struggle even more to keep up with the demand. During the summer of 2026, several American cities push dangerously close to this newly discovered threshold. Combine high humidity with heat that refuses to drop at night, and you get conditions where the human body is under constant compounding stress, hour after hour, with no true chance to recover. This is very different from a single blazing hot afternoon that cools off once the sun sets. This is a body under siege around the clock. The scariest part is that wet bulb temperature is almost never reported to the public. Weather apps show you the regular temperature, sometimes the heat index, which is a rough estimate of how hot it feels. Almost nobody sees the actual wet bulb number, the one that tells you whether your own sweat can save you or not. As you will see, this invisible number was quietly climbing across America throughout 2026, hidden behind the more familiar headlines about record-breaking heat, and in some places it came far closer to the edge than most people ever realized. Picture two scenes. In the first, you are standing in Phoenix, Arizona, at 3 in the afternoon. The thermometer reads 115 degrees. The sun is brutal, the pavement seems to shimmer, and the heat feels like opening an oven door. In the second scene, you are standing in Newark, New Jersey, at 7 in the morning. The thermometer reads only 82 degrees. It seems like the safer scene by far, but according to the science of wet bulb temperature, the humid morning in Newark can sometimes be more dangerous to your body than the scorching afternoon in Phoenix. This sounds impossible until you remember what actually determines danger. Not the number on the thermometer, but whether your sweat can evaporate. Phoenix sits in a desert. Its air is extremely dry, often below 20% humidity during a heat wave. That dry air acts like a hungry sponge, pulling moisture off your skin rapidly, which means your sweat evaporates fast and your cooling system works, even at extreme temperatures. This is why Phoenix regularly hits 110 degrees or higher, and its residents, while uncomfortable, are not dropping in the streets by the thousands. Their bodies still have a way to release heat. Newark, and much of the humid eastern United States, works completely differently. The air is often heavy with moisture, especially in the early morning hours after a hot, muggy night. That moisture-soaked air cannot accept much more sweat, so your cooling system stalls out even at a temperature that looks mild on paper. Your body keeps generating heat, keeps trying to sweat, and keeps failing to actually cool down. This is uncompensable heat stress creeping in quietly, disguised as an unremarkable summer morning. There is a second factor that makes this even more dangerous, and it has nothing to do with the daytime peak at all. It is what happens, or does not happen, overnight. Normally temperatures drop significantly after sunset. This nighttime cool down gives your body, your home, and your entire city a chance to recover from the day's heat. Air conditioners work more efficiently. Buildings release stored heat back into the cooler night air. Most importantly, your own body gets a break, a chance for your internal temperature to reset before the next day's heat begins building all over again. During the extreme heat events that struck the United States in the summer of 2026, this nighttime recovery vanished in many places. In parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, overnight lows barely dipped out of the high 70s and low 80s. Humidity stayed thick even after dark. Buildings that had absorbed heat all day never fully released it before the sun rose again and the entire cycle repeated. Doctors and emergency room staff consider this lack of overnight relief one of the most dangerous parts of a prolonged heat wave. A single hot day is stressful but survivable for most healthy people. Days and days of heat with no true nighttime break is a different story entirely. Your body's internal thermostat, the one that is supposed to reset every 24 hours, never gets the chance. This is precisely the trap that formed over huge sections of the eastern United States as summer began. And it did not happen because of one unlucky hot spell. It happened because of an enormous, slow-moving weather system, one that meteorologists have a specific name for, and one that would return to punish the country not once, but 3 separate times before summer was over. Most heat waves last a few days and move on. What happened across the United States in the summer of 2026 was something else entirely. A pattern that struck not once, but 3 separate times, each wave arriving like a punch after the last one had barely faded. The first wave hit in late June and intensified through the 4th of July holiday, an especially cruel piece of timing considering it landed during the country's 250th birthday celebrations. Temperature records were tied or broken in several major cities across the United States and Canada, with a peak of 106 degrees recorded in Atlantic City, New Jersey on the 4th of July. Millions of Americans planning fireworks and barbecues instead found themselves searching for the nearest air-conditioned building. Through the 4th of July, more than 165 million Americans across the Midwest and East faced either major or extreme heat-related health risk, according to the National Weather Service's experimental heat tracking system. That is roughly half the population of the entire country, all under warning at the same time. Just as that first wave began to fade, the sky turned on the country in a different way. Severe thunderstorms swept across the United States between July 4th and 6th, breaking up the heat dome but leaving over 1,300,000 power outages and 4 additional deaths in their wake. The storms even produced the largest hailstone ever recorded in the state of Connecticut. Extreme weather, it turned out, was not finished with the country. It had simply changed its weapon. A brief lull followed. Then heat returned again on July 15th, this time tying daily temperature records at airports in the Lehigh Valley region. The very next day, something strange happened. The heat did not fully build back because smoke from massive wildfires burning across Canada drifted down and dimmed the sun, turning skies orange and hazy across parts of the northeast. For one of the only times in recent memory, wildfire smoke had actually interrupted a heat wave. But the reprieve did not last. By late July, a third heat dome formed, this time settling over the western and central United States, placing tens of millions more Americans under new heat advisories with no overnight relief predicted through the start of August. 3 separate heat domes, one after another, hitting different regions of the same country in a single summer. This is not how heat waves are supposed to behave. A single brutal heat wave can be explained away as bad luck, an unfortunate alignment of weather patterns. 3 of them, stacking up back to back across a single season, points towards something bigger happening in the atmosphere itself. To understand why this kept happening again and again, you need to understand the actual mechanism behind a heat dome. It is not simply hot weather. It is a specific physical trap in the sky, one that acts almost like a lid clamped down over an entire section of a continent. And once you understand how that lid works, you start to see why it became so hard for the country to escape it. Think of the atmosphere above the United States as a pot of water on a stove. Normally, heat rises and escapes, weather systems move through, and no single region stays trapped under the same conditions for too long. A heat dome breaks this natural cycle by placing an enormous, invisible lid directly on top of the pot. Here is how it forms. High up in the atmosphere, several miles above the ground, a mass of warm air builds into what meteorologists call a ridge, essentially a bulge of high pressure. Under normal conditions, this ridge would drift along with the rest of the weather patterns crossing the country. But sometimes, the larger atmospheric currents that usually push weather systems eastward slow down or stall entirely. When that happens, the ridge stops moving. It parks directly over one region and simply sits there, sometimes for a week or more. This stalled ridge acts exactly like a lid on a pot. Air trapped underneath it gets compressed, and compressed air heats up. The same basic physics that makes a bicycle pump warm when you use it. That compressed, sinking air also blocks clouds from forming, which means there is nothing to block the sun during the day, and nothing to trap in cooler air overnight either, once the heat has fully built up in the ground and buildings below. The result is a region locked under clear skies, blazing sun, and no incoming weather to break the pattern. Normal summer thunderstorms, the kind that usually interrupt a hot stretch every few days, cannot form or push through. The heat dome essentially defends itself, using its own structure to prevent the very weather that would end it. This is precisely what happened across the eastern United States, heading into the 4th of July weekend in 2026. A powerful ridge locked into place over more than 2/3 of the country, trapping surface heat and humidity beneath it like a greenhouse. Meteorologists watched as the system refused to budge, day after day, while temperatures and heat indexes climbed to dangerous, sometimes record-shattering levels underneath it. What makes heat domes especially dangerous compared to a normal hot spell is their duration. A single hot day allows the ground, buildings, and human bodies a chance to cool overnight before the cycle resets. A heat dome removes that reset button entirely. Each day, the ground absorbs more heat than it releases the night before. Asphalt, concrete, and buildings act like batteries, slowly charging up with stored heat that has nowhere to go. By the third or fourth day trapped under the same dome, an entire city can feel measurably hotter than the actual air temperature would suggest, purely because everything around you has become saturated with stored heat. Scientists who study this pattern have noticed something troubling in recent years. These stalled, slow-moving ridges appear to be forming more often and lasting longer than they used to. There is an ongoing scientific debate about whether a warming Arctic is weakening the fast-moving currents high in the atmosphere that would normally push these ridges along, essentially loosening the mechanism that used to keep heat domes temporary instead of long-term. Whatever the deeper cause, the effect on the ground was unmistakable in the summer of 2026, and nowhere did that effect show up more dramatically than in the nation's capital, where a holiday meant to celebrate the country's 250th birthday instead delivered a heat record that had stood since before most people alive today were born. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people gather on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to watch fireworks explode over the Washington Monument. In 2026, that celebration carried extra weight. It marked the 250th anniversary of the United States, a milestone anniversary planned for years in advance. Nobody could plan around what the sky had in store. The heat dome that settled over the eastern United States shattered the record for the warmest 4th of July in Washington, D.C.'s history, with the temperature climbing to 103 degrees. Think about what that means. Washington has been keeping detailed weather records since the 1800s. Through wars, through economic depressions, through over a century and a half of 4th of July celebrations, no one had ever recorded a hotter Independence Day than this one. The heat did not stop at the capital's border. Philadelphia recorded 3 consecutive days above 101 degrees for the first time in the city's entire recorded history. 3 days in a row in a city that has existed since colonial times, that had never once happened before. Meanwhile, Atlantic City tied its all-time hottest temperature ever recorded, reaching 106 degrees. Across the region, at least 148 daily high temperature records were set in just 6 days, between June 30th and July 5th. This was not one city having an unlucky hot day. This was an entire region, spanning multiple states, simultaneously breaking records that in many cases had stood for generations. Officials scrambled to respond. In New York City, the mayor activated a heat emergency plan, opening hundreds of cooling centers across the city and directing outreach teams to check on vulnerable residents who might not have a safe way to escape the heat. Similar emergency measures rolled out in cities across the affected region, as officials recognized this was not a normal hot spell that people could simply wait out. Here is what makes this event particularly significant to scientists. A record broken by 1 degree in one city could reasonably be dismissed as an unusual fluctuation, but a record broken by multiple degrees, across dozens of cities, spanning multiple states, all during the same several-day stretch, points towards something more systematic happening. Individual daily records are influenced by countless small local factors. When that many records fall simultaneously across such a wide area, it suggests the entire background climate driving these events has shifted. Underneath the historic numbers were real human costs. Cities had to shorten or cancel parts of their 250th anniversary celebrations, forced to weigh the symbolism of the moment against the very real danger of heat stroke in massive outdoor crowds. Some fireworks displays were pushed later into the night, hoping the darkness would bring at least some relief from the sun, even if the underlying heat and humidity refused to fully break. But the temperature records, as dramatic as they were, told only part of the story. Behind the scenes, in control rooms most Americans never think about, engineers were fighting an entirely different kind of battle, one measured not in degrees, but in gigawatts. As air conditioners across the eastern seaboard ran at full power simultaneously, the electrical grid supplying tens of millions of homes was approaching numbers it had never been forced to handle before. Atlantic City sits directly on the Atlantic Ocean, its boardwalk built to catch cooling sea breezes that have historically kept the city more comfortable than inland areas during summer heat waves. This coastal advantage is exactly why its all-time record is so significant. When a coastal city tied its hottest temperature ever recorded, it revealed that even locations with a natural, built-in cooling mechanism were no longer safe from the extremes building across the country. Atlantic City reached 106 degrees Fahrenheit on July 4th, a peak that tied or broke temperature records across several major cities in both the United States and Canada. For a beach town that markets itself partly on being an escape from inland summer heat, this was a signal that the old rules were changing. Coastal cities like Atlantic City typically benefit from something meteorologists call the sea breeze effect. During the day, land heats up faster than the ocean beside it. The hot air over the land rises, and cooler air from over the water rushes in to replace it, creating a natural breeze that keeps coastal temperatures several degrees lower than areas even a short distance inland. This effect has protected shore communities from the worst of summer heat for as long as people have kept weather records in the region. But a heat dome as powerful as the one that struck in July of 2026 can overwhelm even this natural defense. When the high-pressure ridge sitting above the region grows strong enough, it can suppress the normal sea breeze pattern entirely, allowing intense heat to build even along the immediate coastline. This is precisely what appears to have happened, since a coastal city hitting a temperature that ties its all-time record suggests the protective ocean effect was simply not strong enough to hold back the broader pattern. There is a deeper concern buried inside this coastal record, one that stretches beyond a single hot weekend. Coastal areas across the United States have historically been considered somewhat safer havens during extreme heat events, both because of the sea breeze effect and because of the higher humidity typically keeping overnight temperatures from swinging as wildly as they do inland. If that protection is weakening, it means millions of Americans who live along the East Coast, in cities they may have chosen partly because coastal weather felt more moderate, may need to rethink how much protection their location actually provides during future heat waves. This pattern connects to something climate scientists have been tracking for years across ocean temperatures worldwide. Warmer ocean water changes how effectively the sea breeze mechanism functions, and it also means the air moving in off the ocean, even when it does arrive, carries more built-in heat and humidity than it would have decades ago. The very system that once cooled cities like Atlantic City may be gradually losing its edge. None of this happened in isolation. As Atlantic City and the rest of the mid-Atlantic baked under record heat, an entirely different crisis was quietly building just beneath the surface of daily life, one most residents would not even notice until their lights started flickering or their air conditioning suddenly went silent in the middle of the hottest night of the year. There is a specific moment during a heat wave that doctors and emergency responders dread more than the peak afternoon temperature. It is not when the thermometer hits its highest number under the blazing sun. It is later, well after dark, when the temperature is supposed to drop and simply does not. Under normal summer conditions, nighttime brings relief. The sun sets, the ground stops absorbing new heat, and temperatures fall steadily through the night, often dropping 15 or 20 degrees from the daytime peak by early morning. This overnight cool down is not just a comfort, it is a biological necessity. Your body, your home, and your entire city depend on this nightly reset to recover from the stress of the previous day before the next one begins. During the July 2026 heat dome, this reset largely disappeared across parts of the affected region. Overnight temperatures in areas of New Jersey and Pennsylvania stayed in the high 70s and low 80s, nowhere close to the normal summer nighttime lows residents were used to. Humidity remained thick even after sunset, meaning the air held onto its moisture and refused to let sweat evaporate efficiently, even in the supposed coolness of night. This mattered enormously for public health, and here is why. Homes and buildings absorb heat throughout the day, the same way a car sitting in a parking lot bakes in the sun. Normally, once the sun goes down and outdoor temperatures fall, that stored heat slowly radiates back out into the cooler night air, and buildings gradually return closer to a comfortable temperature by morning. When nighttime temperatures stay elevated, this release process stalls. Buildings essentially stay charged with heat day after day, compounding with each cycle rather than resetting. For anyone without reliable air conditioning, this compounding effect can turn dangerous quickly. A single hot day inside a poorly cooled apartment is uncomfortable, but usually survivable. Several consecutive days and nights without any real temperature drop is a different situation entirely, one where indoor conditions can become nearly as dangerous as being outside in direct sun, particularly on upper floors of buildings where heat naturally accumulates. Health officials specifically flagged the lack of overnight relief during the New Jersey heat emergency as a factor that prevented buildings from cooling and compounded physical stress on residents. This detail explains something that might otherwise seem confusing: why some of the most serious heat-related medical emergencies did not occur during the hottest part of the afternoon, when people are naturally cautious and seeking shade, but rather accumulated silently overnight, when people assumed they were safe simply because it was dark outside. This is one of the most dangerous misconceptions about extreme heat. Darkness does not automatically mean safety. A bedroom that never drops below 80 degrees, with humidity thick enough to prevent sweat from evaporating, can be nearly as taxing on the human body as standing outside at noon. The difference is that far fewer people recognize the danger, because it does not look or feel like the heat waves they picture in their minds. This silent overnight danger becomes especially critical when you consider what happens when the electricity keeping a home's air conditioning running suddenly disappears. And during the summer of 2026, across a heat-stressed power grid serving tens of millions of people, that scenario became a very real possibility for hundreds of thousands of American households. Walk into an emergency room during a major heat wave, and you will notice something unusual almost immediately. The waiting room feels differently than it does during a typical week. Instead of a steady trickle of unrelated injuries and illnesses, doctors see waves of patients arriving with strikingly similar symptoms: confusion, rapid heartbeat, skin that is either drenched in sweat or, more alarmingly, completely dry and hot to the touch. That last symptom, dry hot skin, is one of the clearest warning signs medical staff watch for. It means a patient's body has completely given up on sweating, the cooling system has shut down entirely, and their internal temperature is climbing unchecked. This is the clinical picture of heat stroke, the most severe and dangerous stage of heat-related illness, and without fast treatment, it can kill within hours. During the July 2026 heat emergency, hospitals across the affected states activated emergency protocols specifically designed for mass heat casualty events, the same category of response typically reserved for major disasters. Staff prioritized rapid cooling above almost everything else, since research shows that how quickly a heat stroke patient's body temperature comes back down directly determines their chances of survival and their risk of permanent organ or brain damage. Ice packs, cooling blankets, and in severe cases, full-body immersion in ice water became standard emergency treatments, deployed as fast as possible after a patient arrived. Emergency medicine doctors describe a specific pattern they watch for during major heat events. The first wave of patients tends to arrive relatively early, often construction workers, athletes, or others who were pushing through physical activity outdoors and misjudged how dangerous the conditions had become. But a second, often more serious wave arrives later, sometimes overnight or the following morning, made up largely of elderly patients and people with chronic health conditions whose bodies simply could not keep pace with days of accumulated heat stress, even without any strenuous activity involved at all. This second wave is what worries hospital staff most, because these patients often do not realize how much danger they are in until their symptoms have already progressed significantly. An elderly person sitting quietly in a hot apartment, not exercising, not even fully aware they are overheating, can still develop heat stroke purely from prolonged exposure to high indoor temperatures, especially if certain medications interfere with their body's ability to sweat effectively in the first place. Beginning in late June and intensifying from July 1st through July 5th, the severe heat wave that spread from the Midwest and South into the Northeast put roughly 180 to 200 million people under major or extreme heat alerts. Multiply the hospital scene described above across that enormous population, spread over dozens of cities simultaneously, and you begin to understand the true scale of strain placed on the American medical system during this single stretch of days. Behind every statistic about record temperatures and broken heat records lies this less visible reality: exhausted emergency room staff, overflowing waiting rooms, and families receiving devastating news about relatives who seemed perfectly fine just hours earlier. To understand why heat stroke turns deadly so quickly once it begins, you need to look inside the body itself, at the exact biological cascade that occurs once your internal temperature crosses a critical line. Your brain runs on a strict temperature budget. Under normal conditions, your internal body temperature hovers right around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regulated by a tiny structure deep in your brain called the hypothalamus, which functions essentially like a thermostat. It constantly monitors your internal temperature and triggers responses: sweating, increased blood flow to the skin, even the urge to seek shade, all designed to keep you within a very narrow, safe range. Heat stroke begins the moment this thermostat gets overwhelmed. Once your core body temperature climbs above approximately 104 degrees Fahrenheit, your body crosses from manageable heat stress into a genuine medical emergency, one where every additional minute of exposure increases the risk of permanent damage or death. Here is what happens inside you during those critical minutes. As your internal temperature rises, your blood vessels near your skin surface widen dramatically, an attempt to release heat by bringing more blood close to the surface where it can radiate away. This diverts a huge amount of blood flow away from your internal organs, including your brain, your kidneys, and your digestive system. Your heart, sensing the drop in blood pressure this causes, starts pumping harder and faster, trying to compensate, but this only generates more internal heat from the extramuscular effort, making the underlying problem worse rather than better. Meanwhile, the proteins inside your cells, the microscopic machinery that keeps every part of your body functioning, begin to lose their structure at high enough temperatures, similar to how the clear egg white in a frying pan turns solid and white once heat is applied. This is not a metaphor doctors use loosely. It describes something close to the literal biological process occurring inside a body during severe heat stroke, particularly within the brain and vital organs, where this kind of cellular damage can become permanent within a shockingly short window of time. Confusion is often one of the very first outward signs that this internal cascade has begun, since the brain is especially sensitive to rising temperature. Someone experiencing heat stroke may become disoriented, speak strangely, or act uncharacteristically irritable or aggressive, symptoms that bystanders sometimes tragically mistake for intoxication or an unrelated medical episode rather than recognizing them as a heat emergency requiring immediate action. Direct heat-related death occurs specifically because the body's core internal temperature climbs too high for it to continue cooling itself, at which point essential biological functions simply cease to operate. This clinical description captures something important. Heat stroke is not merely an extreme version of feeling hot and uncomfortable. It is a genuine systems failure, comparable in severity to a major heart attack or stroke, where minutes of delayed treatment can be the difference between full recovery and permanent injury or death. The good news is that heat stroke is highly treatable if caught early enough. Rapid cooling, submerging a patient in ice water or applying cold packs to the neck, armpits, and groin where large blood vessels sit close to the skin, can bring core temperature down fast enough to prevent lasting damage in many cases. The tragedy is how often heat stroke goes unrecognized until it has already progressed too far, particularly among two groups of people whose bodies are especially vulnerable to losing this fight in the first place. Not every human body handles extreme heat the same way. Two groups sit at dramatically higher risk than everyone else: young children and elderly adults. Understanding why reveals something important about how fragile our cooling system actually is at both ends of the human lifespan. Start with young children. A child's body has a larger surface area relative to their overall body mass compared to an adult, which means they absorb heat from their surroundings faster than grown adults do. At the same time, children's sweat glands are less developed and less efficient at producing the volume of sweat needed to cool a body down during extreme heat, since this system continues maturing throughout childhood. Combine faster heat absorption with a less capable cooling system, and you get a body that can overheat significantly faster than an adult standing in the exact same conditions. Children also frequently cannot recognize or communicate their own overheating symptoms effectively, especially very young children or infants. An adult feeling dangerously overheated can usually recognize the warning signs and seek shade or water. A toddler often cannot, which is precisely why hot car deaths, tragedies where a child is accidentally left inside a parked vehicle, remain such a devastating and persistent problem every single summer across the country, since a car's interior can reach lethal temperatures within a shockingly short window of time, even on a day that does not feel extremely hot outside. Elderly adults face a different but equally serious set of vulnerabilities. As the human body ages, its ability to sweat efficiently naturally declines, meaning older adults produce less sweat and start sweating later into a period of heat exposure, compared to younger adults facing identical conditions. Aging also affects the cardiovascular system's ability to redirect blood flow toward the skin quickly, a critical part of the body's cooling response, which means an elderly heart has to work harder to achieve the same cooling effect a younger heart manages more easily. Medications commonly prescribed to older adults compound this vulnerability further. Certain blood pressure medications, common diuretics, and various other prescriptions can interfere with the body's ability to sweat effectively, or can increase the risk of dangerous dehydration during extreme heat, without the person necessarily realizing their medication is adding an extra layer of risk on top of their age-related vulnerability. Of the 44 heat-related fatalities reported during the July 2026 heat wave, the majority occurred among vulnerable populations, spread across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, New York, and Mississippi. Behind that regional breakdown lies a consistent pattern seen in nearly every major heat event. Elderly residents, often living alone, often without reliable air conditioning, represent a disproportionate share of the fatalities, even though they frequently never left their own homes during the crisis. This vulnerability becomes especially dangerous when combined with another factor entirely outside of any individual's control, whether or not their home actually has a working air conditioning system in the first place. And across the United States, millions of households enter every single summer without this basic protection at all, a gap in safety net that turns an already dangerous heat wave into something far more lethal for the families caught inside it. Most Americans assume air conditioning is universal, a basic feature of modern life that essentially everyone has access to during a heat wave. The truth is more complicated and far more dangerous than that assumption suggests. New data from the United States Census Bureau and the Energy Information Administration shows that about 93% of the country's 127 million households had air conditioning in 2023, which means roughly 9 million households across the country had no air conditioning at all. 9 million households. That is not a small statistical footnote. That is tens of millions of individual Americans entering every single summer heat wave with zero mechanical way to cool their living space, regardless of how extreme outdoor temperatures become. This gap is not evenly distributed across the country. Older housing stock, particularly in older cities in the Northeast and Midwest, was frequently built decades before central air conditioning became standard, and many of these buildings were never retrofitted with the systems, either due to cost, the physical layout of the building, or landlords simply never prioritizing the upgrade. Lower-income households are disproportionately represented among the 9 million without air conditioning, which means the parts of the population already facing the most economic strain are frequently the same populations left most exposed during dangerous heat events. Even among households that technically do have air conditioning, having a unit does not guarantee it gets used. Running air conditioning around the clock during an extended heat wave can become extremely expensive, and for households on tight budgets, the choice between running a cooling system continuously and paying other essential bills is a genuine, agonizing decision, not a hypothetical one. Some people simply cannot afford to run the equipment they technically own, which functionally places them in nearly the same dangerous position as households with no air conditioning at all. Recognizing this gap, some states have begun implementing new protective policies. New York State's Public Service Commission approved a comprehensive policy in March 2026 that prohibits utilities from disconnecting service for non-payment during declared extreme heat events, specifically to prevent vulnerable households from losing access to cooling during the exact moments they need it most. This type of policy represents a growing recognition among lawmakers that access to cooling has effectively become a matter of public health and safety, not merely a matter of comfort or convenience. Cities have also expanded emergency cooling centers, public spaces like libraries, community centers, and designated emergency shelters that open specifically during declared heat emergencies to give residents without adequate air conditioning somewhere safe to spend the hottest hours of the day. These cooling centers operate free of charge, remain open to the general public without requiring identification, and many accommodate people with disabilities while permitting service animals inside. But cooling centers only help if people know they exist, can physically travel to them, and are willing to leave their homes, which is not always a simple assumption, particularly for elderly residents with limited mobility or families without reliable transportation. The gap between having a policy on paper and that policy actually reaching every vulnerable household remains one of the most persistent challenges in American heat emergency response. This entire vulnerable population, The 9 million households without air conditioning, plus the additional millions who cannot afford to run the systems they own, faced an especially frightening scenario during the summer of 2026, one that had nothing to do with heat directly and everything to do with what happens when the electrical grid itself starts to buckle under unprecedented demand. There is a specific chain of events that turns a routine power outage into a medical emergency, and understanding it reveals why grid failures during extreme heat represent one of the most dangerous, underappreciated risks facing American communities today. It starts innocently enough. A transmission line goes down, perhaps damaged by a storm, or simply overwhelmed by unprecedented electrical demand. Air conditioning units across an entire neighborhood shut off simultaneously. At first, this might not seem alarming. Many people have weathered power outages before without serious incident, but a power outage during a heat wave behaves completely differently than one occurring during mild weather, because of a specific physical process happening inside buildings that most people never consciously think about. Interior spaces without cooling can reach dangerous body temperature threshold levels surprisingly fast, with an exterior temperature of 95 degrees capable of pushing an uncooled home's upper floors past safe thresholds within just 1 to 2 hours. This speed catches people off guard constantly. Most residents, accustomed to occasional brief power outages during storms, assume they have plenty of time before conditions become genuinely dangerous. In reality, that window closes far faster than intuition suggests, particularly in upper-floor apartments or poorly ventilated rooms where heat naturally accumulates most severely. Researchers who study behavior during power outages have identified a specific common pattern that turns manageable situations into medical emergencies. People tend to wait and see whether power will be quickly restored rather than immediately seeking alternative cooling. And this hesitation is precisely what allows a simple outage to escalate into a genuine crisis. This waiting instinct makes intuitive sense. Nobody wants to abandon their home unnecessarily or overreact to what might turn out to be a brief inconvenience. But during an active heat emergency, that same instinct can become genuinely life-threatening, especially for elderly residents or anyone with underlying health conditions who may not recognize their own worsening symptoms until it is already quite late. The July 2026 heat wave delivered exactly this scenario to hundreds of thousands of American households simultaneously. More than 200,000 customers lost power specifically due to the 4th of July heat wave, with additional outages expected as the heat continued building toward its peak. Each one of those outages represented a household suddenly thrust into the exact dangerous chain of events described above, often with little to no warning beforehand. Compounding the danger further, severe localized thunderstorms swept through the region on July 3rd and 4th, damaging transmission lines and knocking out power to nearly 1 million homes and businesses at the precise moment temperatures remained at their most extreme. Think about the timing here. These outages did not occur during a mild stretch of weather where losing air conditioning would be a minor annoyance. They occurred at the exact peak of a historic heat emergency, striking nearly 1 million households simultaneously, right when functioning air conditioning mattered most for survival. Health officials specifically noted that the combination of extreme heat and power loss proved fatal for many residents, since air conditioning systems were disabled during the hottest hours of the entire weekend, leaving already vulnerable populations without any cooling option whatsoever. This single sentence captures the entire dangerous chain reaction described throughout this chapter, condensed into its most tragic real-world outcome. What caused so many transmission lines and grid systems to fail simultaneously, right at the moment they were needed most? The answer leads directly into one of the most dramatic, high-stakes engineering stories of the entire summer, one playing out inside massive regional power grids straining under electrical demand records that had stood, in some cases, for 2 full decades. Picture the entire eastern United States as a single enormous circuit, with tens of millions of homes all reaching for the same switch at the exact same moment. That is essentially what happened as the July heat dome reached its peak. Air conditioners in millions of buildings, from single-family homes to hospitals to office towers, all kicked into overdrive simultaneously, and the electrical grid built to serve them all strained toward a breaking point most Americans never think about until it actually happens. Power demand on the largest grid in the United States surged to a record this week, as the searing heat dome continued hovering over the eastern part of the country, halting some of the nation's Independence Day festivities in the capital itself. A grid record is not a small thing. These systems are engineered with massive amounts of built-in capacity specifically to handle rare extreme demand spikes. Breaking a record means the actual demand pushed past even those carefully planned safety margins. With 160 million people across 30 states under alert for extreme temperatures, the United States Department of Energy declared an emergency as the heatwave bore down on a huge portion of the nation's electrical grid. This is not a routine warning. A federal energy emergency declaration signals that officials believe the grid is at genuine risk of widespread failure without direct intervention. The Secretary of Energy issued a formal energy emergency alert, directing the operators of the nation's largest electrical grid to take specific action, preventing blackouts and ensuring critical operations, including hospitals, remained fully functional throughout the heatwave. Notice what got singled out for special protection. Not shopping malls, not office buildings, hospitals. The government was explicitly planning for the possibility that not every part of the grid could be kept running, and prioritizing the facilities where a power failure could directly cost lives. A university energy expert told reporters the heat was going to seriously strain the grid, predicting that peak demand records would likely fall across multiple geographic areas simultaneously. This prediction proved accurate almost immediately. Forecasts leading into the holiday weekend projected heat indices, the feels-like temperature combining heat and humidity, soaring to 100 degrees in Chicago and Detroit, 110 in New York City, 112 in Philadelphia, 113 in Washington, D.C., and 111 in Nashville. Every single one of those numbers translates directly into millions of additional air conditioning units running simultaneously, each one pulling more electricity from a grid already stretched to its limits. Grid engineers describe electrical demand almost like water pressure in a massive plumbing system. Every additional air conditioner, every extra refrigerator working harder in the heat, every data center running additional cooling to protect its own equipment adds pressure to the same shared system. Push that pressure high enough, and something eventually has to give, whether that means rolling blackouts deliberately imposed to protect the broader system, or uncontrolled equipment failures that can cascade unpredictably across enormous geographic areas. This was not an abstract engineering concern playing out safely behind the scenes. It was a real-time crisis unfolding at the exact same moment doctors were treating heat stroke patients, families were losing power to their air conditioning, and millions of vulnerable Americans were depending entirely on that same electrical grid simply to stay alive through the hottest days of their lives. To understand exactly how close the system came to failing, you need to step inside the specific grid that bore the heaviest burden of all, one serving 67 million Americans across an entire region of the country. Most Americans have never heard the name PJM, yet it quietly powers their daily lives more directly than almost any single company or government agency they could name. PJM Interconnection is the electrical grid serving 67 million people across 13 states and the District of Columbia, making it the largest coordinated power grid in the entire country. When engineers talk about American electrical infrastructure reaching a breaking point, PJM is very often the system they mean. During the July 2026 heatwave, PJM faced numbers unlike anything in its long operating history. Demand on the grid climbed to approximately 162 gigawatts on July 2nd, the second highest electrical load recorded in PJM's nearly 100-year operating history, just below the all-time record of 165,563 megawatts set back in 2006. To put that in perspective, a single gigawatt roughly equals the output of an entire large nuclear power plant. PJM was essentially asking for the electrical equivalent of over 160 nuclear reactors running at full output simultaneously, just to keep air conditioners humming across its territory. Independent forecasts predicted PJM's peak electricity demand would reach 166.3 gigawatts during the July 4th week, likely surpassing the grid's previous summer record of 165.6 gigawatts, set back in 2006. Think about the time span involved here. A record that had stood for 2 full decades, through every summer heatwave in between, was projected to fall in a single week. Recognizing the scale of the threat, the United States Department of Energy declared a formal emergency, specifically for PJM, the nation's largest regional grid, ordering specific measures designed to prevent blackouts while keeping essential services running throughout the crisis. These emergency measures typically include directing power plants that would normally sit idle, often older or less efficient facilities, to fire up and contribute extra electricity to the shared system, along with coordinating with neighbouring grids to import additional power across state lines wherever possible. One detail from inside the crisis reveals just how many different pressures were converging on the grid at the exact same moment. Roughly 9.5 gigawatts of generation sat offline due to outages in the Mid-Atlantic region alone, including facilities serving data centers heavily concentrated in Northern Virginia. This detail matters more than it might first appear. At the precise moment the grid needed every available watt of generating capacity, a meaningful chunk of that capacity had simultaneously gone offline, likely due to the same extreme heat placing physical stress on power generation equipment itself, not just on the demand side of the equation. Grid operators describe this scenario as a genuine nightmare combination: skyrocketing demand colliding with reduced supply, both driven by the exact same underlying cause. The heat was not just forcing people to use more electricity, it was simultaneously making it physically harder for power plants and transmission equipment to reliably generate and deliver that electricity in the first place, since extreme heat degrades the efficiency of nearly every piece of electrical infrastructure involved in the entire chain. PJM held on. No widespread catastrophic blackout occurred across the region during this particular event, a genuine engineering achievement given the numbers involved. But holding on required active emergency-level intervention from the federal government itself, a clear signal that the margin between routine grid operation and genuine cascading crisis had grown uncomfortably thin. And PJM was far from alone in facing this exact predicament. As the heat dome intensified through late July, the crisis expanded well beyond the Mid-Atlantic region that PJM serves. A separate emergency was unfolding simultaneously across an entirely different part of the country, one covering 17 states and an equally massive population depending on uninterrupted electricity. A southwestern heatwave ignited a grid emergency, prompting the Department of Energy to act, as the agency issued an emergency order directing the Southwest Power Pool to gather backup generation units and additional power specifically to prevent blackouts across 17 states caused by the extreme heat. This was not an isolated, one-time event limited to a single dramatic weekend. The grid operator remained under a conservative operations advisory for multiple consecutive days in a row, repeatedly extending the emergency status due to persistent concerns about higher than normal electrical loads, unexpected equipment outages, seasonally extreme temperatures, and the possibility of reduced wind and solar power generation at the exact moments the grid needed it most. That last detail deserves special attention because it reveals a genuine vulnerability hiding inside modern power systems. Wind and solar power now supply a meaningful share of electricity across large sections of the country, but extreme heat waves are frequently associated with unusually still air and specific atmospheric patterns that can reduce both wind power generation and, counterintuitively, even solar panel efficiency, since extreme heat actually reduces how effectively solar panels convert sunlight into usable electricity. This means the exact same heat dome driving up electrical demand can simultaneously undermine some of the very power sources meant to help meet that demand. The Department of Energy's emergency order specifically authorized the Southwest Power Pool to activate designated generation units and backup power resources purely for the purpose of maintaining overall grid reliability across the entire 17-state region. This authority does not get invoked casually. It represents the federal government stepping directly into regional grid operations, overriding normal day-to-day processes because officials judge the risk of widespread failure to be serious enough to warrant direct intervention. Consider what these back-to-back emergency declarations actually reveal when viewed together. Within the same summer, the federal government declared electrical grid emergencies covering both the largest grid in the eastern United States and a separate massive 17-state region spanning the central part of the country. Two of America's most critical electrical systems, serving well over 100 million Americans between them, both required direct federal intervention within the same several-week stretch, simply to keep the lights and the air conditioning running through record heat. Hospitals occupied a special place in every one of these emergency response plans, and for good reason. A hospital losing power during a mass heat casualty event would not simply be an inconvenience. It would mean patients on ventilators, in intensive care, or undergoing active treatment for heat stroke suddenly losing access to the life-sustaining equipment keeping them alive at the exact moment the broader community was experiencing its highest volume of heat-related medical emergencies all summer long. Grid operators and emergency planners specifically designed their intervention priorities around preventing this exact nightmare scenario from occurring. What these grid emergencies reveal, when placed alongside the historic temperature records covered earlier, is a country whose basic infrastructure is being tested by conditions it was not originally engineered to handle at this frequency or intensity. The grid held this time through emergency federal intervention and a genuine engineering effort spanning multiple states. But holding the line required extraordinary measures rather than routine operation, a distinction that raises an uncomfortable question about what happens the next time a heat dome arrives, one that later chapters in this story will need to confront directly. Somewhere behind almost every phone call you make, every video you stream, and every search you type into your phone sits a massive building filled with humming machines. These are data centers, and most Americans never think about them, even though they now compete directly with millions of homes for the exact same electricity, especially during a heat wave. A data center is essentially a giant room packed with computer servers, the physical machines that store and process information for everything from social media apps to online banking to the artificial intelligence tools rapidly expanding across the economy. These servers generate enormous amounts of heat simply by operating, similar to how your laptop grows warm on your legs after an hour of use, except multiplied across tens of thousands of machines running inside a single building, non-stop 24 hours a day. To keep these servers from overheating and shutting down, data centers run their own massive cooling systems, essentially industrial-scale air conditioning, dedicated entirely to keeping computer equipment at a safe operating temperature. During a heat wave, this creates a strange kind of competition most people never consider. The outdoor temperature that makes your home air conditioner work harder does the exact same thing to a data center's cooling system, forcing it to pull dramatically more electricity from the grid at the precise moment millions of homes nearby are also demanding more power for their own air conditioning. During the peak of the July heat wave, roughly 9.5 gigawatts of generation outages struck the Mid-Atlantic region, an area that includes data centers heavily concentrated in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia deserves special attention here, since it has become one of the largest concentrations of data center infrastructure anywhere in the entire world, a direct result of its proximity to major internet infrastructure and its historically reliable electrical grid. This concentration creates a genuine strategic tension for grid operators. On one side sits the everyday electricity needs of millions of residential customers trying to stay safe and cool during dangerous heat. On the other side sits an enormous and rapidly growing industry that depends on constant, uninterrupted power to function, an industry that has expanded dramatically in recent years as demand for artificial intelligence and cloud computing services has surged across the economy. Grid planners increasingly describe this as one of the most significant emerging challenges facing American electrical infrastructure going forward. Data center electricity demand has grown so rapidly in certain regions that it now represents a meaningful and fast-rising share of total grid capacity, arriving at the exact same moment. Climate-driven heat waves are independently pushing residential demand to record levels. Two entirely separate forces, one technological and one climate-related, are converging on the same limited electrical infrastructure simultaneously. This does not mean data centers are somehow to blame for grid emergencies during heat waves. The infrastructure crisis runs deeper than any single industry. But it does mean that as America's data-driven economy continues expanding, and as heat waves continue intensifying, the competition for reliable electricity is only going to grow more intense, adding yet another layer of pressure onto a grid system already straining under the direct effects of the changing climate itself. As the electrical crisis continued unfolding through July, an entirely different kind of extreme weather arrived to complicate the picture even further, delivering a violent reminder that the same atmospheric instability driving record heat could just as easily flip into an entirely different, equally dangerous form of destruction within a matter of hours. Extreme heat and violent storms might seem like opposites, one calm and scorching, the other chaotic and wet. In reality, they are frequently connected, two different expressions of the same underlying atmospheric instability, and the summer of 2026 delivered a dramatic demonstration of exactly how quickly one can transform into the other. As the intense heat dome finally began breaking apart in early July, the same atmospheric energy that had been trapped and building for days did not simply vanish. It needed somewhere to go. Severe thunderstorms swept across the United States between July 4th and 6th as the heat dome broke apart, and these storms possibly produced the largest hailstone ever recorded in Connecticut state history. Understanding why this happens requires picturing the atmosphere as a pressure cooker rather than a simple oven. During a heat dome, enormous amounts of heat energy accumulate near the ground, trapped beneath the high-pressure ridge sitting overhead. When that ridge finally weakens or shifts, allowing cooler air and moisture to push back into the region, the collision between the built-up surface heat and the incoming cooler air can trigger extremely violent thunderstorm activity, sometimes far more intense than storms that form under normal, less extreme conditions. Hail forms specifically when powerful updrafts inside a thunderstorm carry raindrops far up into freezing altitudes, where they turn to ice, before eventually falling back down through the storm. The most powerful updrafts, the kind fueled by the release of enormous stored heat energy, following a prolonged heat dome, can suspend these ice particles for far longer, allowing them to accumulate layer after layer before finally growing too heavy for the storm to hold aloft any longer. A record-breaking hailstone forming in the immediate aftermath of a record-breaking heat wave is not coincidence. It is the same underlying energy, released through an entirely different mechanism. This transition from extreme heat directly into extreme storms created a uniquely dangerous compound crisis for emergency responders already stretched thin from days of handling heat-related medical emergencies. Instead of getting a clean break to recover and restock supplies, crews had to pivot immediately into storm response mode, dealing with downed trees, flooded roads, and damaged electrical infrastructure, all while heat-related patients from the preceding days were still recovering in hospitals across the region. Climate scientists have observed this pattern of extreme heat transitioning rapidly into extreme storm activity becoming more pronounced in recent years, part of a broader trend where a warming atmosphere holds more moisture and more available energy overall, creating conditions for more violent weather transitions whenever a stable pattern like a heat dome finally does break down. The heat itself becomes a kind of fuel source, one that gets released explosively once the atmospheric lid holding it in place finally lifts. For millions of Americans, this meant the relief of finally escaping record temperatures arrived bundled together with an entirely new and immediate danger, one involving flying debris, flash flooding, and yet another wave of electrical outages striking communities that had barely begun recovering from the heat crisis in the first place. There is a common assumption that once a heatwave finally breaks, the danger has passed. The storms that swept through the eastern United States in early July 2026 proved this assumption dangerously wrong, delivering a fresh wave of destruction and death precisely when many residents believed the worst had already ended. The storms that broke up the initial heat dome between July 4th and 6th resulted in over 1,300,000 power outages and 4 additional fatalities. 4 deaths directly tied to storm activity, arriving immediately on the heels of dozens of heat-related deaths from the preceding days, meant the overall human toll of this single extreme weather episode kept climbing even after headlines had begun shifting away from the heat itself. These storm-related deaths typically occur through mechanisms completely different from heat stroke, yet no less sudden or tragic. Falling trees and branches, weakened by drought stress from the preceding heat, and then struck by intense wind gusts, can crush vehicles or structures with little warning. Flash flooding, often triggered when intense rainfall falls onto ground that has been baked hard and impermeable by weeks of extreme heat, can overwhelm drainage systems within minutes, catching drivers and pedestrians off guard in situations that escalate far faster than most people expect. The connection between the preceding heat and the storm's destructive power runs deeper than simple timing. Ground that has been baked by an extended heat dome often becomes significantly less able to absorb rainfall compared to normal conditions, since intense, prolonged heat can harden soil and reduce its natural capacity to soak up water. When heavy rain from a storm arrives on top of this hardened ground, far more water runs off the surface rather than soaking in, dramatically increasing the risk and speed of flash flooding compared to an identical storm falling on ground that had not been baked by preceding extreme heat. Over 1,300,000 homes and businesses lost power during this storm event, adding an entirely new wave of outages directly on top of communities that in many cases were still actively dealing with outages from the heatwave itself. For households caught in this overlap, the danger compounded rather than resolved. Some residents experienced power loss stretching across both the initial heat crisis and the subsequent storm crisis, meaning their exposure to a home without reliable air conditioning extended across an even longer and more dangerous stretch of time than either individual event would have caused on its own. Emergency management officials increasingly plan for this exact compound scenario, recognizing that a major heat dome breaking apart into severe storms represents not a resolution to the crisis, but rather a transition into a second, distinctly different phase of the same broader emergency. Recovery resources that might normally focus entirely on heat-related medical response instead had to split immediately towards storm damage assessment, downed power line safety, and flood response, stretching already exhausted personnel and equipment even further. This pattern of compound extreme weather, one dangerous event flowing directly into another entirely different type of dangerous event, would repeat itself again just days later, though through a mechanism that few Americans would have predicted: smoke drifting down from wildfires burning hundreds of miles away in an entirely different country. Just as a second wave of heat began building in mid-July, something strange happened across parts of the American Northeast. The sky itself changed colour, shifting toward a hazy orange tint that turned the sun into a dim, reddish disk hanging low even in the middle of the day. The cause had nothing to do with the heat dome directly. It was smoke, carried hundreds of miles on the wind from massive wildfires burning across Canada. Record heat returned to the region on July 15th, tying the daily temperature record at Lehigh Valley International Airport with a high of 98 degrees. But heating was notably limited the very next day, July 16th, due to smoke drifting down from the 2026 Canadian wildfires. This detail reveals something genuinely unusual about how these different extreme weather phenomena can interact with and influence one another in unexpected ways. Wildfire smoke works almost like an accidental temporary sunshade when it settles thickly enough over a region. Dense smoke particles in the atmosphere can block a meaningful portion of incoming sunlight from reaching the ground, similar to how a heavily overcast day feels cooler than a clear sunny one, even at the exact same underlying air temperature. In this specific case, smoke drifting down from Canadian wildfires actually interrupted a developing heat wave, preventing temperatures from climbing quite as high as they otherwise would have. This might sound like good news, a natural if bizarre form of relief arriving unexpectedly. In reality, trading extreme heat for thick wildfire smoke represents trading one serious health hazard for another, not a genuine improvement in overall safety. Wildfire smoke contains extremely fine particulate matter, tiny particles small enough to penetrate deep into human lungs and even enter the bloodstream directly, triggering serious respiratory and cardiovascular problems, particularly among people with asthma, existing lung conditions, or heart disease. The broader connection between wildfires and heat waves runs deeper than this single dramatic incident. Extreme heat dries out vegetation across enormous landscapes, turning forests and grasslands into far more flammable fuel than they would be under normal conditions. This means the same broad weather and climate patterns capable of producing dangerous heat domes across the United States are often simultaneously creating the exact dry, hot conditions that allow wildfires to ignite and spread more explosively across neighbouring regions, including in Canada, whose fires increasingly drift smoke down across large sections of the United States during severe fire seasons. What makes this connection particularly significant looking forward is the geographic reach involved. A heat wave typically affects the specific region directly underneath a given heat dome. Wildfire smoke can travel dramatically farther, carried by upper-level winds across state and even international borders, meaning Americans living hundreds or even over 1,000 miles away from an active wildfire can still experience serious air quality impacts from smoke that originated in an entirely different country's forests. This intersection between heat and wildfire smoke represents just one example of how different extreme weather threats increasingly overlap and compound one another rather than occurring as isolated, unrelated events. For the millions of Americans whose jobs require them to work outdoors regardless of these compounding hazards, this overlapping danger created an especially difficult and dangerous set of choices throughout the entire summer. For most Americans, a dangerous heat wave means adjusting daily routines, staying indoors during peak afternoon hours, seeking out air-conditioned spaces, postponing outdoor errands until evening. For millions of other Americans, this kind of flexibility simply does not exist. Their jobs require them to be outside, working physically demanding tasks, regardless of what the thermometer or the wet bulb temperature happens to read that day. Construction workers represent one of the largest groups facing this reality every single summer. Framing a roof, pouring concrete, or operating heavy machinery all require sustained physical exertion, work that generates significant metabolic heat from within the body, adding directly on top of whatever extreme heat already exists in the surrounding environment. This combination, intense physical labor plus extreme ambient heat, creates conditions where the body's cooling system faces the worst possible combination of demands simultaneously, needing to dissipate more heat than usual at the exact moment external conditions make dissipating any heat at all significantly harder. Farm workers face a nearly identical challenge, often compounded by direct sun exposure across open fields with little to no natural shade available throughout an entire workday. Agricultural labor frequently continues through the hottest hours of summer, specifically because certain crops require harvesting or maintenance during particular seasonal windows, leaving workers with limited flexibility to simply wait for cooler conditions the way an office worker might choose to delay a task. Federal workplace safety regulators have not yet finalized a comprehensive heat safety standard for the country, instead relying on an updated national emphasis program effective through 2031 to conduct inspections specifically at high-risk work sites. This regulatory gap matters significantly. Unlike specific detailed federal safety rules covering hazards like electrical work or fall protection, heat exposure protections for outdoor workers currently rely on a less comprehensive inspection-based approach rather than a single uniform national standard specifying exact requirements like mandatory water breaks, shade access, or acclimatization periods for new workers. Some individual states have moved ahead of federal regulation, implementing their own specific heat safety requirements for outdoor workers, though these protections vary considerably depending on where exactly someone happens to live and work. This patchwork approach means two workers performing nearly identical outdoor jobs, facing nearly identical heat conditions, might have dramatically different legal protections available to them, purely based on which state line they happen to work on either side of. Employers in outdoor industries have increasingly adopted voluntary heat safety measures independent of regulatory requirements, including mandatory water breaks, rotating workers through shaded rest periods, and adjusting work schedules to prioritize early morning hours before peak afternoon heat arrives. But these measures depend heavily on individual employer commitment, rather than uniform legal requirement, meaning protection levels can vary dramatically even within the exact same industry and region. The economic reality underlying all of this adds another difficult layer. Many outdoor workers, particularly in agriculture and construction, work in roles where missing a shift due to heat concerns can mean a direct and immediate loss of income, creating genuine financial pressure to continue working even when conditions have become dangerous. This economic vulnerability intersects directly with the physical vulnerability already created by demanding outdoor labor, performed during America's increasingly extreme summer heat waves, compounding risk for exactly the workers who can least afford to simply stay home. Step outside a major American city on a summer evening and then drive 20 minutes into the surrounding countryside, and you might notice something surprising. The temperature can genuinely be several degrees cooler once you leave the dense urban core behind, even though both locations experience the exact same weather pattern and the exact same sunshine throughout the day. This phenomenon has a specific scientific name, the urban heat island effect, and it played a significant role in making the summer of 2026 particularly dangerous for the millions of Americans living in major cities. Cities absorb and retain heat dramatically differently than the natural landscapes they replaced. Concrete, asphalt, and building materials absorb far more solar energy during the day compared to grass, trees, and soil, and these dense urban materials also release that stored heat back out much more slowly once the sun sets. A forest or open field can begin cooling relatively quickly after sunset. A dense urban core covered in heat-retaining materials on every surface continues radiating stored heat back into the surrounding air well into the night, directly contributing to the dangerous lack of overnight cooling relief described earlier in this story. Trees and vegetation play a critical, often underappreciated role in naturally moderating urban temperatures. Beyond simply providing shade, trees release water vapor into the surrounding air through a process called transpiration, which has a genuine cooling effect on the immediate environment, similar in principle to how sweat cools the human body through evaporation. Neighborhoods with substantial tree canopy coverage measurably run cooler than nearby neighborhoods, dominated by pavement and buildings with minimal greenery, sometimes by a difference of several degrees during peak summer conditions. This creates a troubling pattern of inequality within American cities. Historically, lower-income neighborhoods have frequently ended up with significantly less tree canopy coverage and green space compared to wealthier neighborhoods within the exact same city, often as a direct legacy of decades-old discriminatory housing and development policies that shaped which communities received investment in parks and street trees and which did not. The practical result is that during extreme heat events, the exact same city can contain dramatically different temperature conditions block by block, with the lower-income neighborhoods frequently experiencing measurably higher temperatures than wealthier areas located just a short distance away. Building density compounds this urban heat island effect further. Tall buildings clustered closely together can trap heat between them, while simultaneously blocking the natural airflow that would otherwise help ventilate and cool city streets. Waste heat released directly from air conditioning units, vehicle engines, and industrial equipment adds yet another layer of warmth directly into the urban environment, meaning a city's own infrastructure and daily activity actively generates additional heat on top of whatever heat arrives naturally from the sun and surrounding weather patterns. During the July 2026 heat dome, this urban heat island effect meant that residents of dense city neighborhoods, already facing the broader regional heat dome bearing down on the entire area, experienced conditions measurably worse than what the official regional temperature reading might have suggested. For someone living in a heavily paved, tree-sparse urban neighborhood with limited access to air conditioning, the true experienced heat could run several degrees hotter than what nearby weather stations, often positioned at airports surrounded by more open space, were officially recording and reporting to the public. Understanding this hidden layer of urban heat reveals why the story of a heat wave is never truly uniform, even within a single city experiencing what appears to be one shared weather event. And nowhere does this become more extreme than when examining the specific role that pavement itself plays in transforming an already hot day into something approaching an open-air oven. Walk barefoot across a sunny parking lot in the middle of summer, and you will understand something that scientists have measured with remarkable precision. Asphalt pavement, the black surface covering roads and parking lots across nearly every American city, can reach temperatures dramatically higher than the surrounding air temperature, sometimes by 50 degrees Fahrenheit or more during peak summer sun exposure. This happens because of a basic property called albedo, which describes how much sunlight a given surface reflects versus absorbs. Dark-coloured surfaces, like the black asphalt covering most American roads and parking lots, have very low albedo, meaning they absorb the vast majority of sunlight hitting them, rather than reflecting it away. That absorbed solar energy converts directly into heat, and dark pavement has essentially become one of the most efficient heat-absorbing surfaces humans have ever intentionally built at massive scale across entire cities. Once absorbed, this heat does not simply disappear when the sun goes down. Asphalt and concrete both function similarly to a thermal battery, slowly releasing their stored heat back into the surrounding air for hours after direct sunlight has ended. This is a major contributing factor to the urban heat island effect described in the previous chapter, and it directly worsens the dangerous lack of overnight cooling relief that made the July 2026 heat wave particularly deadly for so many Americans. The scale of this problem becomes clear once you consider just how much of a typical American city is covered in pavement. Roads, highways, parking lots, and driveways collectively cover a significant percentage of total urban land area in most American cities, sometimes estimated at close to a third of the total surface area in heavily developed regions. Nearly a third of an entire city functioning as an efficient heat, absorbing and slowly releasing surface represents an enormous, largely invisible contributor to how dangerously hot that city actually becomes during a heat wave, separate entirely from the broader regional weather pattern moving through the area. This pavement effect creates particularly dangerous microenvironments for certain vulnerable groups. Someone walking across a hot parking lot experiences direct radiant heat, rising up from the pavement itself, in addition to the ambient air temperature and any direct sunlight overhead, effectively facing three separate sources of heat simultaneously. Young children, positioned physically closer to the ground due to their shorter height, and pets walking on all four paws directly against hot pavement, both experience this radiant pavement heat far more intensely than an adult standing upright, whose head and torso sit several feet further away from the hottest surface temperatures near ground level. Some cities have begun experimenting with solutions specifically targeting this pavement heat problem, including specialized reflective pavement coatings designed to increase albedo and reduce how much solar energy the surface absorbs in the first place. Early results from these pilot programs have shown measurable temperature reductions on treated surfaces, though implementing these solutions at the massive scale, required to meaningfully affect an entire city's temperature, remains an expensive, long-term undertaking rather than a quick fix available during any single summer's heat emergency. For now, the vast majority of pavement across American cities remains standard black asphalt, quietly absorbing and radiating enormous amounts of heat throughout every summer, adding an invisible but scientifically measurable layer of extra danger on top of whatever broader heat wave happens to be moving through the region above it. Nowhere does this pavement effect combine more dramatically with extreme heat than in the desert cities of the American Southwest. Entire metropolitan areas built directly on top of some of the hottest natural landscapes found anywhere in the country. Phoenix and Las Vegas were built on a promise that human engineering could make even the harshest desert livable. Air conditioning, imported water, and modern infrastructure turned two of the hottest natural landscapes in North America into sprawling metropolitan areas home to millions of people. In the summer of 2026, that promise faced one of its most serious tests yet. As the heat pattern across the United States shifted, with the East Coast finally getting a measure of relief, the West found itself under a new heat dome, with the most severe triple-digit heat threat settling directly over the desert Southwest, hitting popular destinations like Phoenix and Las Vegas particularly hard. For residents of these cities, this pattern was not a rare, shocking event. It was an intensified version of a threat they already live with every single summer, arriving with even greater severity than usual. Phoenix in particular has become something of a real-world laboratory for understanding the outer edges of urban heat survivability. The city regularly records well over 100 days per year above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and its dry desert climate, while sparing residents from the humidity-related dangers described earlier in this story, brings its own distinct set of risks. Extremely low humidity means sweat evaporates efficiently, keeping the body's cooling system functional even at extreme air temperatures. But it also means residents face genuinely blistering peak temperatures, frequently climbing past 115 degrees during the most intense summer heat waves, hot enough to cause severe burns from contact with surfaces like pavement, playground equipment, or car seatbelt buckles within a matter of seconds. Las Vegas faces a nearly identical desert heat profile, compounded by its status as a major tourism destination that draws tens of millions of visitors annually, many arriving from cooler climates with little personal experience managing genuine desert heat safely. Tourists walking the Las Vegas Strip during peak summer afternoons represent a uniquely vulnerable population, often spending hours outdoors without adequate hydration or heat safety awareness, precisely because they are visiting rather than living permanently within a climate they understand and have adapted to. Both cities have developed extensive heat safety infrastructure specifically because they face this threat every single year, rather than as a rare emergency. Extensive networks of cooling centers, hydration stations positioned along popular walking areas, and public health campaigns specifically targeting heat safety represent institutional knowledge built up over decades of experience managing extreme desert heat as a routine, expected part of summer rather than a shocking anomaly. Despite this experience and infrastructure, both cities continue to record significant numbers of heat-related deaths every single year, a sobering reminder that even extensive institutional preparation cannot fully eliminate the danger extreme heat poses, particularly to homeless populations facing chronic outdoor exposure, elderly residents living alone, and anyone lacking reliable access to air conditioning despite living in one of the hottest urban environments in the entire country. What makes the trajectory facing Phoenix and Las Vegas particularly concerning is not simply that they are already extremely hot cities. It is that scientific research increasingly suggests the broader climate patterns driving America's recent heat waves are not temporary anomalies destined to fade, but rather an intensifying trend with a specific, measurable, and well-documented scientific cause behind it. For decades, connecting any single specific weather event directly to broader climate change felt scientifically impossible. Weather has always been variable and chaotic. A single hot summer could always be dismissed as ordinary natural fluctuation, no different from unusually hot summers that occurred throughout history, long before industrial-scale greenhouse gas emissions began altering the planet's atmosphere. That scientific limitation has changed dramatically in recent years, and the summer of 2026 provided a striking demonstration of exactly how. Within days of a major American heatwave beginning, researchers from World Weather Attribution, a scientific consortium specifically dedicated to conducting rapid analyses of extreme weather events, published findings concluding that the specific temperatures experienced in the western United States would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Notice the specific, careful scientific language here. Not simply, climate change made this hotter, but a stronger, more precise claim. This particular level of extreme heat essentially could not have occurred at all in a world without human-driven warming. This attribution analysis compared the observed 2026 temperatures against detailed historical weather data, stretching back to 1900, alongside sophisticated computer climate models specifically designed to simulate what weather patterns would look like in a hypothetical world without human-caused changes to the atmosphere. This comparison represents the core methodology behind modern climate attribution science, essentially running two parallel versions of the same weather event, one using the real world's current, human-altered atmosphere, and one using a simulated version of the atmosphere as it likely would have existed without significant industrial greenhouse gas emissions. The specific numbers this analysis produced are worth sitting with directly. The study found that climate change added between 4.7 and 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit to the temperatures actually experienced during this specific 2026 heat event. Several degrees Fahrenheit might sound modest at first glance, but remember everything covered earlier in this story about wet bulb temperature thresholds and the razor-thin margins separating survivable heat stress from genuine heat stroke. An additional 5 to 7 degrees can represent the entire difference between a dangerous but survivable heat wave and one that pushes vulnerable populations directly across a lethal threshold. Without the added impact of climate change, the researchers determined the probability of such a record-breaking heat event occurring would have been vanishingly small, essentially confirming that record-breaking events of this specific magnitude have become virtually impossible without human-caused climate change already factored into the picture. This finding transforms the entire framing of a heat wave like the one covered throughout this story. It was not simply an unusually hot summer that happened to occur. It was a measurable, quantifiable product of decades of accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, expressed directly through the specific temperature records broken across American cities in July of 2026. This is precisely the kind of scientific claim that would have been essentially impossible to make with real confidence just 20 years ago. The methods behind this rapid attribution science represent one of the most significant recent advances in climate research, transforming climate change from an abstract long-term global trend into something that can now be measured and quantified within the specific, individual heat waves striking American cities in real time, sometimes within days of the event itself actually occurring. How exactly do scientists prove that a specific heat wave, occurring on specific dates in specific American cities, was made worse by climate change, rather than simply being an unusually hot summer that would have happened regardless? The answer lies in a rapidly evolving scientific field called attribution science, and understanding its methodology reveals why these claims carry genuine scientific weight rather than speculation. The foundational challenge scientists face is that you cannot simply rerun history to see what would have happened without climate change. There is only one actual timeline that occurred. To work around this fundamental limitation, attribution scientists build sophisticated computer climate models, essentially digital simulations of Earth's atmosphere, calibrated using real-world historical weather data extending back over a century. These models get run twice, using two different sets of underlying assumptions. The first version incorporates the actual real-world levels of greenhouse gases currently present in Earth's atmosphere, reflecting the genuine warming that has already occurred due to over a century of industrial emissions. The second version strips out this human-caused warming entirely, simulating what the same atmospheric and oceanic conditions would theoretically look like in a hypothetical world where industrial greenhouse gas emissions never significantly altered the climate in the first place. Scientists then run each of these two model versions many thousands of times, since weather naturally involves an enormous amount of random variability, even within a stable climate. Running thousands of simulations for both scenarios allows researchers to build a genuine statistical picture of how likely a specific extreme event, like a particular heat wave hitting a particular region with a particular intensity, would be to occur under each scenario. If a specific extreme heat event turns up frequently across the thousands of simulations run with current real-world climate conditions, but almost never appears across the thousands of simulations run using the hypothetical world without human-caused warming, that comparison provides genuine statistical evidence that climate change made the specific event significantly more likely to occur, or significantly more intense than it otherwise would have been. This methodology has been rigorously tested and refined across dozens of previous extreme weather events worldwide, allowing scientists to publish findings with increasing speed and confidence. What once might have taken years of careful academic study to establish can now sometimes be completed within days of an extreme weather event actually occurring, allowing scientists to connect specific real-time weather disasters directly to climate change while that event is still fresh in public attention, rather than only being able to discuss climate change in vague, abstract long-term terms disconnected from any single specific storm or heat wave people had actually just experienced. Prominent climate scientists tracking global temperature trends have forecast that 2026 will likely rank among the 4 hottest years ever recorded globally, though still falling short of the record set previously in 2024. This broader global context matters because it places the specific American heat waves covered throughout this story within a much larger pattern, one extending across the entire planet rather than being isolated purely to the United States. This raises an important and genuinely uncertain question looking forward. If 2026 already ranks among the hottest years ever recorded, and if scientists have proven that climate change directly intensified this summer's specific heat waves, what happens next depends heavily on a separate additional climate factor that was already quietly building in the background throughout the same year, one with the potential to push temperatures even higher still. Buried within the same scientific reporting covering America's 2026 heat crisis sits a warning about an entirely separate climate phenomenon, one with the potential to make everything covered throughout this story significantly worse in the near future. Scientists call it El Niño, and a particularly intense version of it may already be forming. In June of 2026, the United States National Weather Service confirmed that El Niño conditions were present, with meteorologists noting the possibility of an especially intense event sometimes referred to as a super El Niño, developing further as the year progressed. El Niño describes a recurring natural climate pattern centered in the Pacific Ocean, where surface waters across a large stretch of the tropical Pacific grow significantly warmer than usual for an extended period, typically lasting anywhere from 9 months to 2 years before eventually fading. This ocean warming pattern might seem geographically distant from American heat waves occurring thousands of miles away, but El Niño's effects ripple outward across the entire global climate system in well-documented, scientifically established ways. Climate scientists have specifically predicted that these El Niño conditions would likely bring higher overall temperatures and an increased likelihood of additional heat waves as the year continued. The mechanism behind this connection involves how El Niño redistributes heat energy throughout Earth's oceans and atmosphere, generally pushing global average temperatures upward during years when a strong event is actively occurring. Looking specifically toward the following year, Recent forecasts modelling the El Niño pattern suggest that 2027 is increasingly likely to experience what scientists term a super El Niño, an especially intense version of the phenomenon that could potentially push global average temperatures above 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. This particular temperature threshold carries enormous scientific and political significance, representing a specific warming limit that international climate agreements have specifically targeted as a critical danger line the world should ideally avoid crossing. Think about the timing this creates. The intense heat waves covered throughout this entire story occurred during 2026, a year when El Niño conditions were only just beginning to develop and had not yet reached their full potential intensity. If a genuine super El Niño event does fully develop as forecast heading into 2027, it could arrive stacked directly on top of the same long-term climate warming trend that attribution scientists already proved intensified the 2026 heat waves covered earlier in this story. This combination, a naturally occurring but intense super El Niño layered directly on top of decades of accumulated human-caused warming, represents one of the most concerning near-term climate scenarios currently being discussed among scientists. It suggests the extreme heat conditions covered throughout this entire story, as dangerous and record-breaking as they already prove to be, might not represent a temporary peak that fades naturally afterward, but rather an early preview of conditions that could intensify further in the very near future, potentially within just a single additional year. Step back from any single heat wave, any single city's broken record, or any single power grid emergency, and a much larger pattern comes into clear focus. The individual events covered throughout this story did not occur in isolation. They occurred within a single calendar year that is on track to rank among the hottest years ever measured across the entire planet. Zeke Hausfather, a climate scientist affiliated with both Berkeley Earth and Carbon Brief, has forecast that 2026 will likely end up ranking among the 4 hottest years ever recorded globally, falling just short of the all-time record previously set in 2024. Being among the top 4 hottest years ever recorded, out of well over a century of detailed global temperature measurements, places 2026 in genuinely rare territory, a distinction that becomes especially significant considering how many of the previous record hottest years have all clustered within just the past decade. This broader global ranking helps explain why so many individual, seemingly separate American weather events, the heat domes, the grid emergencies, the wildfire smoke, the severe storms, all occurred within the exact same several-month stretch. These were not disconnected, unrelated incidents that happened to coincide by unlucky chance. They represent different regional expressions of the same underlying global climate pattern, one where elevated baseline temperatures worldwide create the atmospheric conditions that make extreme regional heat events, along with their related cascading consequences, significantly more likely to occur simultaneously across multiple different forms. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, widely regarded as the most comprehensive and rigorous scientific review of global climate trends available anywhere, states with what it terms virtual certainty that there have been clear increases in both the intensity and duration of heat waves, along with an increase in the total number of heatwave days occurring at the global scale. Virtual certainty represents about as strong a level of scientific confidence as researchers ever express about any complex real-world phenomenon, reflecting an overwhelming convergence of evidence collected across many decades and countless independent studies worldwide. The same comprehensive scientific assessment also notes with high confidence that concurrent heat waves occurring alongside droughts will likely continue increasing in frequency, creating compound risks that multiply on top of one another rather than remaining separate, isolated hazards. This finding directly connects to several of the compounding dangers already covered throughout this story. The way extreme heat dried out vegetation ahead of dangerous wildfire activity, the way baked, hardened ground worsened flash flooding, once storms finally arrived, and the way overlapping electrical grid emergencies stretched emergency response capacity across multiple simultaneous crises, rather than allowing recovery time between separate, isolated events. Understanding 2026 within this broader global context transforms how the entire story should be read. This was not simply an unusually rough American summer that residents can reasonably expect will fade back toward historical normal conditions once the specific weather pattern eventually passes. It represents a data point within a clear, decades-long trend, one where the scientific evidence increasingly suggests conditions experienced this year may become significantly more common, rather than remaining a rare anomaly, as the underlying global climate continues warming in the years directly ahead. Everything covered throughout this story, the record-breaking American heat, the grid emergencies, the heat stroke deaths, represents genuinely dangerous conditions. But American cities, even during their worst 2026 heat waves, have not yet crossed the absolute theoretical survival threshold that scientists established using wet bulb temperature. Other places on Earth already have, and understanding those extreme cases reveals exactly what could eventually be at stake if current climate trends continue unchecked. Scientists studying this exact threshold have confirmed that the critical wet bulb temperature limit of 35 degrees Celsius, the point beyond which even a healthy young person would eventually die after roughly 6 hours of continuous exposure, has already been crossed approximately a dozen separate times in real-world conditions, occurring mostly across South Asia and the Persian Gulf region. A dozen times might sound like a relatively rare, isolated occurrence. But remember that this specific threshold represents an absolute hard biological limit, the exact point where the human cooling system stops functioning entirely, regardless of hydration, shade, or any other protective measure available. Crossing it even a dozen times anywhere on the planet represents a genuinely alarming milestone that had essentially never occurred throughout most of recorded human history. Climate researcher Colin Raymond, affiliated with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, has projected that wet bulb temperatures will begin regularly exceeding this critical 35-degree threshold at multiple locations worldwide within the coming decades, specifically if global temperatures continue rising toward 2.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The word regularly carries enormous weight in that specific projection. Moving from a dozen rare, isolated historical crossings toward regular recurring occurrences at multiple locations represents an entirely different category of risk, one where entire regions could eventually become seasonally uninhabitable without reliable access to air conditioning for weeks or even months at a stretch during peak summer conditions. Newer scientific research suggests the true danger threshold sits considerably lower than this theoretical 35-degree limit when accounting more realistically for actual human physiology under real-world conditions. Updated physiological survivability limits developed through more sophisticated modelling correspond to wet bulb temperatures ranging from approximately 25.8 to 34.1 degrees Celsius for younger adults, and an even lower range of 21.9 to 33.7 degrees Celsius for older adults, representing reductions of nearly 1 to over 13 degrees Celsius below the traditional 35-degree assumption. This downward revision matters enormously for understanding genuine risk. It means dangerous, potentially lethal wet bulb conditions could be reached at temperatures and humidity combinations considerably less extreme than scientists previously assumed, particularly for older adults, whose bodies, as covered earlier in this story, already face measurably reduced cooling capacity purely due to natural aging. Regions that might have seemed comfortably distant from theoretical survivability, limits under the older, more conservative 35-degree threshold, may actually sit considerably closer to genuine danger than previously understood, once this more realistic physiological research gets properly factored into the analysis. While no American city crossed this ultimate threshold during the events covered throughout this story, the underlying trajectory connects directly back to everything already established. Rising global temperatures, an intensifying El Niño pattern potentially still ahead, and a scientifically proven pattern of climate change directly worsening individual heat waves as they occur. The places that have already crossed this survival line represent an early warning sign for what continued warming could eventually mean for American cities as well, a genuinely uncomfortable possibility that raises fundamental questions about how prepared the human body itself actually is for the climate trajectory currently unfolding. Every human alive today carries a body built by evolutionary pressures that unfolded across hundreds of thousands of years, shaped almost entirely by climate conditions that no longer accurately reflect the world we now actually live in. This mismatch between our ancient biology and our rapidly changing modern climate sits at the very heart of why extreme heat has become such a uniquely dangerous and uniquely modern threat. The human sweating system, covered extensively earlier in this story, evolved specifically to handle the climate conditions that existed across the regions where early humans lived and evolved. Conditions that, however hot they sometimes became, never remotely approached the sustained, record-breaking extremes increasingly documented across the modern world. Evolution operates across many thousands of generations, an almost unimaginably slow process compared to how rapidly human-caused climate change has altered global temperatures across barely more than a single century, an evolutionary blink of an eye by comparison. This means the human body arriving into the climate conditions of 2026 is, in every meaningful biological sense, essentially the same body that existed centuries or even millennia ago, one whose cooling mechanisms, whose sweat glands, whose cardiovascular heat response evolved to handle a considerably milder and more stable range of temperatures than what increasingly characterizes the modern climate. We are, quite literally, using ancient biological equipment to face an entirely new and unprecedented thermal challenge. Current scientific understanding places theorized human survivability thresholds at wet bulb temperatures approaching 35 degrees Celsius, beyond which thermoregulation is expected to fail entirely, risking fatal hypothermia within roughly 6 hours of continuous exposure, though researchers note this benchmark stems largely from thermodynamic theory rather than comprehensive empirical human testing. This distinction between theoretical modelling and genuine real-world human data matters significantly, because it means scientists are still actively working to fully understand exactly where the true limits of human heat tolerance actually sit, using increasingly sophisticated laboratory research to refine and correct earlier theoretical assumptions. Human technology, air conditioning chief among these innovations, has allowed modern civilization to effectively decouple daily life from many of these ancient biological limitations, at least for those with reliable access to cooling systems and the electricity needed to power them continuously. But as this entire story has demonstrated repeatedly, that technological buffer is neither universal nor infinitely reliable. 9 million American households lack air conditioning entirely. Power grids serving tens of millions of people came close to genuine failure during 2026's most extreme heat events. And the underlying climate trend driving these dangerous conditions shows no clear sign of reversing course any time in the near future. This creates a genuinely difficult tension at the center of modern American life. We have built astonishing technology capable of making even the harshest desert livable, capable of cooling massive buildings and entire cities against nature's most extreme heat. But that technology depends entirely on infrastructure, on electricity, on economic access, all of which can fail, become unaffordable, or simply prove insufficient during moments of genuinely extreme, prolonged heat stress. Underneath all of our technological adaptation, the ancient biological body facing this modern thermal challenge remains fundamentally unchanged, still bound by the same sweat glands and the same core temperature thresholds that governed human survival long before anyone had ever built a single power plant. Facing a climate trajectory that shows no clear sign of reversing, American cities and states have increasingly shifted from viewing extreme heat as a rare weather event toward treating it as a recurring, predictable public health emergency requiring dedicated infrastructure and policy, similar in seriousness to how communities have long prepared for hurricanes or major winter storms. Cooling centers represent the most visible, immediate piece of this evolving response infrastructure. These facilities operate completely free of charge, remain open to the general public without requiring any form of identification, and many specifically accommodate people with disabilities while permitting service animals inside, removing common barriers that might otherwise prevent vulnerable residents from accessing safe, cool spaces during a dangerous heat emergency. During the July 2026 crisis, cities across the affected region activated extensive networks of these facilities, transforming libraries, community centers, and designated public buildings into emergency refuges for residents lacking adequate cooling at home. Beyond physical cooling infrastructure, policymakers have increasingly focused on utility regulations specifically designed to prevent the dangerous scenario covered earlier in this story, where households lose power precisely when they need cooling most. New York State's comprehensive policy approved in March 2026 specifically prohibits utilities from disconnecting service for non-payment during officially declared extreme heat events, directly targeting the dangerous overlap between financial hardship and life-threatening heat exposure covered extensively throughout this story. This approach extends further, with most utilities maintaining emergency provisions that suspend service disconnections entirely during declared heat emergencies, while directly encouraging residents at risk of losing power due to unpaid bills to contact their utility company immediately for assistance navigating the crisis. Emergency alert systems have similarly evolved considerably in recent years, moving beyond simple temperature warnings toward more sophisticated risk communication tools. The National Weather Service's experimental heat risk product, referenced earlier in this story's coverage of the July heatwave, represents exactly this kind of evolution, translating complex combinations of temperature, humidity, and duration into simplified risk categories the general public can quickly understand and act upon, without needing to personally interpret raw meteorological data or unfamiliar scientific concepts like wet bulb temperature. Outreach programs specifically targeting the most vulnerable populations, elderly residents living alone, people experiencing homelessness, and low-income households without reliable air conditioning, have become an increasingly central component of comprehensive heat emergency response. These programs typically involve direct, in-person, wellness checks conducted by community health workers or volunteers during active heat emergencies, specifically designed to identify and assist residents who might not otherwise reach out for help on their own, whether due to limited mobility, social isolation, or simply not fully recognizing the genuine danger of their own living conditions. Despite this genuine and expanding institutional progress, significant gaps clearly remain. Federal workplace heat safety standards remain unfinalized, as covered earlier regarding outdoor workers. Housing stock across much of the country still includes millions of homes without adequate cooling infrastructure, and policy responses, however well designed, ultimately depend on adequate funding, effective public awareness, and successfully reaching every vulnerable resident before a heat emergency turns genuinely deadly. A coordination challenge that remains extraordinarily difficult to execute perfectly across every single American community, every single time a dangerous heatwave arrives. Everything covered throughout this story, the record temperatures, the strained power grids, the heat stroke deaths, the scientific proof that climate change made these specific events measurably worse, points toward a single, unavoidable question. What comes next? Even as this story was being told, a third heat dome had already formed, battering the central United States for the third separate time in a single summer, placing 80 million additional Americans under new heat advisories, with no overnight relief predicted through the beginning of August. This third wave arrived directly on the heels of 44 confirmed deaths and numerous shattered temperature records from the earlier heat domes covered throughout this story, with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration warning of level 3 to 4 extreme heat risk as the pattern continued developing. 3 separate heat domes, striking different regions of the same country within a single summer season, represents a pattern extreme enough that meteorologists and climate scientists are watching it closely for what it might reveal about future summers still to come. A single heat wave can reasonably be attributed to normal, if unfortunate, weather variability. 3 within one summer, each one breaking significant records, each one straining critical infrastructure, points toward a fundamentally different underlying baseline, one where extreme heat has transitioned from a rare, occasional threat toward an increasingly routine and recurring feature of the American summer itself. The scientific evidence assembled throughout this story converges on a consistent, sobering picture. Climate change has already measurably intensified specific heat waves occurring right now, not merely hypothetical future events still decades away. A potential Super El Nino may add additional warming on top of this already elevated baseline as soon as the following year. Global temperatures continue tracking among the very hottest ever recorded, and the human body itself, along with much of America's aging infrastructure, remains only partially adapted to handle the specific combination of heat and humidity increasingly characterizing the modern American summer. None of this means the situation is hopeless or beyond meaningful response. Grid operators successfully prevented catastrophic, widespread blackouts during 2026's most extreme demand periods, even while operating under genuine emergency conditions. Hospitals treated heat stroke patients using rapid cooling protocols proven to save lives when applied quickly enough. Cities expanded cooling centre networks and utility protections specifically designed to protect the most vulnerable residents. Scientists continue refining exactly where genuine human survivability thresholds sit, work that directly improves how accurately future risks can be predicted and communicated to the public before the next dangerous heatwave arrives. What remains clear is that the pattern documented throughout this entire story, record heat, strained infrastructure, and a body of rigorous science directly connecting these events to long-term climate change, shows no evidence of naturally reversing course on its own. The next heat dome is not a hypothetical possibility somewhere in the distant future. Based on everything covered throughout this story, it is closer to an expected certainty. The only genuine uncertainty remaining is exactly when it arrives, and whether America's infrastructure, its healthcare system, and its most vulnerable residents will be ready for it when it does.